What if the Sahara, which we now see as an endless ocean of dunes, once carried the green weight of rivers, lakes, and forests? And what if traces of such a world still linger quietly beneath the sand? When we look at this desert today, its horizon stretches so far that it seems unchanging, eternal, and yet the earth itself is never still. Over tens of thousands of years, climates shift like slow tides, and landscapes change their face. The Sahara is no exception. Scientists know that in cycles shaped by the tilt of the planet and the rhythm of its orbit, rains once returned here again and again. Where today sand dominates, there were times when grasslands covered the soil, when hippos swam in rivers, and when people lived near lakes as large as seas. These changes did not happen in a year or even in a lifetime. They unfolded gradually, like a story whispered across generations, with wet periods lasting thousands of years, then fading back into dryness. To understand this rhythm, researchers look not at the desert surface, but at markers preserved in quiet places. Sediments at the bottoms of dried lakes, grains of pollen trapped in mud, dust carried and settled far away. All of these are archives, like pages of a vast natural book. A layer rich in green pollen tells of a time when grasses thrived. A band of fine dust in ocean cores signals when winds carried sand across continents. Each trace is small and fragile, but together they form a pattern. Still, we must remember that patterns are never perfect. Evidence is partial, sometimes damaged, sometimes missing. A dried riverbed seen from above is a clear sign of water's passage, but it does not tell us exactly when it flowed or for how long. Fossilized fish bones found in desert sands suggest ancient lakes, but they cannot speak of the people who might have lived nearby. In this way, our knowledge is always provisional, like a map drawn with faint lines, useful but never final. Now let us imagine gently. If a community had built homes along one of those great green rivers, what would remain after the waters retreated and centuries of sand moved in? Walls might collapse, roofs vanish, but stone foundations could linger under layers of dust. Pottery fragments might survive, carried by shifting dunes, then buried again. And if no hands disturbed them, they could remain hidden for thousands of years. Over longer spans of time, however, wind itself becomes an eraser. Just as parchment fades when touched too often, stone carvings are worn down, inscriptions blurred until they look like ordinary rock. What survives best is often what was hidden quickest. Like a bone sealed in mud or a tool covered by flood deposits, these traces become part of the desert's deep archive, waiting for us to notice. Now we pause on another kind of evidence, more distant yet just as telling. Even in places far from the Sahara, scientists find dust in ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica. In those layers, tiny particles reveal when the Sahara was especially dry, when winds lifted sand into the skies and spread it across the planet. That global fingerprint is another reminder of the desert's changing moods. It shows us not only what happened locally, but how strongly one region can affect the whole earth. If we carry the thought further, if rivers once returned, they may return again, though not in the time scales we usually measure life by. Tens of thousands of years may pass before rains shift back, greening the Sahara once more, and if that happens, what lies buried might resurface slowly. A foundation stone here, a tool there, revealed by water, washing the sand aside. Or perhaps nothing will be found, only new grass covering forgotten layers. The uncertainty is not a flaw. It is simply the nature of time. Absence of evidence does not close the door. It only leaves it open, waiting. And so, the Sahara teaches us a quiet lesson. Deserts are not empty. They are only paused. They are landscapes in between states, keeping their memories in stone, dust, and silence. When we think of what might lie beneath, we are reminded that the earth holds more than we see, and that patience is part of listening to its story. What if the Sahara that we see now, vast and arid, was once a place where life thrived in abundance, where rivers crossed the plains and lakes mirrored the sky? When we pause to imagine this transformation, it feels almost like picturing an ocean suddenly becoming a meadow. Yet this is not only imagination. It is something science carefully traces through the Earth's quiet records. We are speaking here of time that stretches far beyond written history, measured not in centuries but in tens of thousands of years, when climates shifted in cycles too slow for a single lifetime to notice. The desert as we know it has not always been the same. Its dryness is a chapter, not the whole story. To understand how this happens, we may think of the planet itself as moving in slow rhythms, like a clock with many hands. The tilt of Earth's axis, the wobble of its rotation, the shape of its orbit, all change gradually, altering how sunlight falls on different regions. Scientists call these cycles Milankovitch cycles, but we may imagine them more simply as the breathing of the planet, gentle in, gentle out. When northern summers received more sunlight, rains moved northward, and the Sahara turned green. When the pattern shifted back, dryness returned, and dunes grew. The mechanism is not mystical, but deeply physical, tied to the geometry of earth and sky. Still, we cannot reconstruct every detail with certainty. The traces we read are incomplete, and nature does not keep perfect archives. A dried riverbed tells us water once flowed, but it does not reveal its depth or whether it lasted for decades or millennia. Layers of sediment at the bottom of an ancient lake preserve pollen and shells, but erosion and time sometimes erase parts of the record. Even radiocarbon dating, a method that measures how long ago something lived by the decay of carbon atoms, has limits. Like any tool, it provides estimates, not exact dates. This means our knowledge is always framed with humility. What we cannot see is as vast as what we do. Yet, within what we do find, the language of traces is clear enough to outline the story. In the sands of Niger and Chad, fossils of fish and crocodiles have been uncovered, reminders that deep water once pooled there. In places where today only dust gathers, rock art shows giraffes, elephants, and herds of cattle, painted by hands that lived in greener times. Even the Sahara's dunes carry signals. Their alignment and grain size hint at ancient wind directions, which themselves reflect whether the land was dry or wet. Far away, deep in the Atlantic Ocean, cores of sediment contain layers of Saharan dust blown over during dry periods. In wetter ages, the dust layers thin, like faint whispers between stronger lines. Step by step, these signals combine like threads woven into a larger cloth. Now let us imagine gently. Suppose we stand not in today's desert, but in the Sahara of 8,000 years ago. Around us are savannas, with tall grasses rippling in the breeze. A wide river flows nearby, carrying fish and watering herds of animals. Human communities build small villages along the banks, using mud and reeds. Over time, families grow, trade begins, and paths become routes. Then slowly, the rains withdraw. At first, just shorter seasons, then years of dryness. The river shrinks, Lakes recede, grasses fade to dust. The villages thin out. People move away, some following the water, some fading into the dunes. What remains are broken fragments, scattered but preserved beneath settling sand. As centuries pass, the land forgets its green face, and the desert as we know it spreads again. In this thought, we see not certainty, but possibility, shaped by what evidence allows us to glimpse. What we can conclude with care is simple. The Sahara is not timeless in its aridity. It has turned green, and it may turn green again in distant cycles. This rhythm is a reminder that landscapes are never fixed. They are chapters in a longer story, and within each chapter, some memories linger. Traces of rivers, bones of fish, drawings on stone. These are the faint voices of a greener Sahara, waiting patiently beneath the silence of sand. What if the very sands that stretch endlessly across the Sahara are not only barriers, but also keepers, holding within them quiet records of worlds we can no longer see? To think of sand only as emptiness would be misleading. Each grain is a fragment of stone, carried by wind, smoothed by time, and then laid down in layers that cover what lies beneath. When we consider this, the desert becomes less a void and more a vast archive, though an archive written without titles or indexes. In this way, what seems erased may only be hidden, resting under blankets of sediment that protect as much as they conceal. Now let us pause and notice how these layers build themselves. Wind moves sand across the land in slow waves, burying valleys, filling old river channels, and creating dunes that shift but also preserve. Sediment, which is simply the fine material left behind by wind or water, behaves like soft bedding, cushioning what lies below. When a tool, a bone, or a wall fragment falls into such a cover, it may be shielded from weather, just as something stored in a drawer can last longer than if it were left outside. Over thousands of years, such coverings can accumulate in great depth, leaving behind silent vaults of history. Yet we must acknowledge what we cannot easily know. Sand is restless on the surface, but can be stubborn in its depth, making excavation difficult. The desert offers few natural windows into what it holds, unlike mountains or cliffs that show their layers openly. What evidence survives is often found by chance: a fossil exposed by wind, a stone fragment uncovered by erosion. This means our understanding remains partial, dependent on scattered glimpses. What we cannot see beneath may be far greater than what we have found, and so we must proceed with patience, knowing absence of discovery is not the same as absence of existence. Still, there is a language written in these layers, a language we are slowly learning to read. Geologists study strata, the bands of sediment and stone stacked through time. Each band can tell of an age, a darker one rich in organic matter, marking a wetter, greener phase, a lighter one dominated by dust, signaling dry years. Within some layers, tiny isotopes, atoms with different weights, record the chemistry of the air and water in their time. Just as the rings of a tree can tell us of seasons long gone, so too can these mineral records whisper of climates, floods, and droughts that shaped the land. Now we may imagine gently. Suppose a community lived in a fertile basin during one of the Sahara's green periods. Over centuries, they built homes of stone and clay, planted crops along a river's floodplain, left behind pottery, tools, and fire pits. Then, as the climate shifted, rains dwindled, and dunes began to advance. The settlement was abandoned, walls slowly collapsed, and sands rose around them. With time, What was once a place of life became a faint shadow beneath sediment. Thousands of years pass. The surface tells nothing, yet underground fragments remain sealed, untouched, as if sleeping. In another step of thought, we can imagine those fragments lying still until some shift, a river cutting a new course, a satellite peering with deep sensors, or a careful excavation, brings them back into light. What emerges may be a shard of pottery, a tool of flint, or perhaps only the shape of a forgotten wall. Whether such a discovery happens in our era or not at all remains uncertain, but the possibility is held within the sand itself. From this, we may draw a quiet conclusion. The Sahara's layers are not only barriers, they are keepers of memory. They guard what they cover, though imperfectly, and they remind us that what seems empty is often full of hidden stories. We cannot say what rests beneath with certainty, but we can say with care that sand is not silence. It is a patient medium, recording traces of the past and holding them for those who know how to look. In this sense, the desert is less a void than a library, though one whose pages are buried, whose books have no titles, and whose shelves stretch beyond sight. To walk across it is to move across unspoken time, each step passing over histories not yet revealed. What if the first stories of Atlantis, preserved not in stone or sand, but in words, were never meant as literal maps, but as mirrors of thought, reflections of memory, or even as teaching tools? When we return to the origin of this tale, we arrive in ancient Greece, more than 2,000 years ago, at the writings of Plato. He placed Atlantis within his dialogues, shaping it as a city of great order, of circles and canals, of power that eventually declined. For Plato, it was not only a place but also a story that carried lessons about balance, hubris, and the fragility of human achievements. To read him today is to listen to an echo that traveled far beyond its original context. The question remains how much of this echo reflects memory and how much is shaped by metaphor. Ancient texts are not like modern reports. They were often crafted to weave ideas into narrative, to illustrate through story what could be harder to convey through plain argument. Atlantis appears within such a framework, between philosophy and allegory. It may be a tale drawn from older traditions, or a thought experiment to warn of arrogance. We cannot know with certainty. Here the limits of knowledge become clear. Plato is our earliest source, and no independent records of Atlantis survive from before him. Archaeologists find no direct inscriptions naming it, no carved stones that unambiguously describe its fall. This absence does not disprove, but it does remind us that we must tread carefully. To build a picture from one voice alone is to work with a fragile foundation. Yet there are indirect ways of listening. The Greeks often borrowed and reshaped stories from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other neighbors. Ancient Egyptian priests, for instance, were described as keepers of vast timelines, guardians of events spanning thousands of years. Plato himself claimed that parts of the Atlantis story came through Solon, a statesman who once visited Egypt. If so, Atlantis might have been an echo of even older records, filtered and reshaped across languages and centuries. Oral traditions, especially when they pass through many hands, are like rivers that change their course. They may still carry water from the same spring, but the channel is altered by the terrain. Let us pause a moment with the language of traces here. Unlike stone or pollen, the traces in texts are not chemical or material, They are patterns of words, repetitions of themes, cross-references between cultures. Scholars compare these patterns, noting when similar motifs, floods, lost islands, golden ages, appear across traditions. Such repetitions may suggest shared memory of real events, like rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, or they may reflect the universal human habit of shaping myths around the cycles of nature. We cannot be certain which is true in each case, but the traces themselves are valuable signals. Now, we may imagine quietly. If Atlantis were once a real place, perhaps Plato's account was a blurred memory of a society that thrived and then vanished, its memory passing through Egyptian archives before reaching Greek ears. Step further, and perhaps that society was not as grand as described, but still remarkable enough to live on in story. Step further still, and perhaps Atlantis was only a parable, never a city, yet still shaping human imagination for centuries. In each case, the result is the same. The tale survives, echoing far beyond its source, becoming part of cultural memory. What we may conclude with care is that Plato's words, whether memory or metaphor, opened a space of possibility. They invited generations to look for lost worlds, to wonder about vanished civilizations, to ask how human greatness might rise and fall. The absence of independent confirmation does not close this space. It only leaves it open, inviting questions rather than final answers. And so, in this story of Atlantis, we find not a map with precise directions, but a mirror, reflecting both ancient thought and our own quiet longing for what might have been. What if, hidden in the heart of the Sahara, a vast circular structure quietly preserved the memory of something greater than geology alone? In Mauritania, there lies such a formation, known today as the Rishat structure, but often called the Eye of the Sahara. From the ground, it seems like weathered ridges of rock, but when seen from above, its shape reveals itself. Immense concentric rings spread across 40 kilometers like ripples that froze in stone. It has drawn attention not only for its scale, but also for its form, which some find reminiscent of Plato's description of Atlantis, with its alternating rings of land and water. Before we allow imagination to wander too far, let us pause on what science tells us. The eye is understood as a geological dome, a swelling of the Earth's crust, that erosion carved into layers. Over time, softer rock wore away, harder layers remained, and the result was a natural spiral, vast and symmetrical. What looks like design may emerge from processes as slow and blind as the wearing down of stone under wind and rain. Just as a seashell grows in spirals without intent, so too can the earth shape such forms without human hands. Yet, even with this understanding, the structure remains striking. Now let us consider the limits of knowledge. We cannot yet determine every detail of how the eye formed. Some explanations suggest a volcanic origin, though no clear lava deposits remain. Others speak of an uplift, a slow bulge created by deep forces, then sculpted by erosion. Data are fragmentary, taken from surveys, from field studies, from satellite images. They show patterns, but not a complete record. This uncertainty leaves room for speculation, though we must hold such thoughts lightly. A place can be both scientifically explained and still mysterious in its resonance. The language of traces here is geological. Each ring marks a layer of rock, some nearly 500 million years old. Within them are sandstones, quartzites, and shales, each recording an environment long past. Shale points to ancient seas. Quartzite suggests strong pressure over time. These are not traces of people, but of worlds before people existed. And yet, if human settlement ever touched the eye, its shape would have been a natural gathering point, an elevated land with circular ridges and nearby water sources in wetter ages. We may imagine gently what this could mean. Suppose thousands of years ago, during one of the Sahara's green phases, people settled around the eye. The ridges offered shelter, the higher ground protection from floods, and the basins between rings a place for water to collect. A village might begin, then a network, using the rings as natural boundaries. Later, as climate dried, the place might be abandoned, the signs of habitation fading while the larger stone form endured. From afar, the story would shrink, remembered not as geology, but as legend. Step further in this thought, and we see how such a natural shape might enter the stream of storytelling. A traveler describing it centuries later might say, "There was a land of rings, once great, now empty." Passed on, retold, translated, such a memory could blend with other myths until it emerged in Plato's dialogues as the rings of Atlantis. This is not certainty. It is a chain of possibilities, each link fragile. We cannot say with proof that the eye is Atlantis. What we can say is that its form naturally invites the comparison, and that such comparisons are part of how humans connect place and story. The careful conclusion, then, is that the eye of the Sahara is first a geological wonder, a patient work of Earth's processes, layered in rock. Whether it also carried echoes that shaped ancient memory, we cannot know. But it remains a place where imagination and science meet, where natural form mirrors human narrative, and where the desert keeps one of its most remarkable faces turned quietly toward the sky. What if beneath the Sahara, where the land today appears dry and lifeless, immense rivers of water still move silently, unseen by the eye? These are the aquifers, natural underground reservoirs, holding water that seeped into the ground thousands, even millions of years ago. To imagine them, we may think of a sponge slowly absorbing liquid. When rain fell in ancient times, much of it filtered down into porous layers of rock, becoming trapped beneath harder, less permeable layers. Over time, these hidden reserves formed vast networks, stretching across borders, lying still under sand and stone. Though we cannot see them directly, their presence is known through wells, through satellite imaging, and through the occasional springs that break the surface in oases. These aquifers are not small. One of the largest beneath the Sahara holds more water than many of the world's great rivers combined. Yet much of this water is what scientists call fossil water. It is not replenished by today's rains because the climate is too dry. It was stored during wetter ages, long before the present desert took its form. To use it is to draw from a memory that cannot easily be refilled. Here we meet a clear limit. While we know the aquifers exist, we do not know their full extent or precise boundaries. Some estimates are made through drilling. Others come from satellites measuring subtle changes in gravity that reveal where water mass lies. Yet these tools, as advanced as they are, give us only outlines, never a perfect map. The hidden rivers of the Sahara are partly charted, but much remains uncertain. Now we turn to the language of traces. The desert floor itself carries marks of the water that once shaped it. From the air, dry channels spread like veins across the sand, ghost rivers no longer flowing, but still visible in their carved paths. In satellite images, these ancient networks appear with clarity, silent signatures of vanished streams. Lake beds, now barren plains, preserve sediments rich in shells and minerals that speak of deep water. Even the distribution of ancient settlements often aligns with these hidden waterways, suggesting that long ago, communities clustered around them, guided by their presence. Let us gently step into imagination. Suppose we could travel back 8,000 years during one of the Sahara's green periods. In such a time, the aquifers would not have been silent. Rivers flowed above them, lakes shimmered under the sun, and the water cycle was active, feeding the underground store as well. People would have gathered along these streams, fishing, farming, leaving behind small marks of their presence. Over centuries, the climate shifted, rains withdrew, and rivers shrank. Yet below, the aquifers held their reserves, quiet witnesses to the change. Step forward to our time, and we may think of how rediscovering these hidden waters could shape lives again. Wells and irrigation have already brought green patches where otherwise the desert dominates. But each use of this fossil water lowers the store, reminding us that it is a non-renewable gift from the past. If drawn too quickly, it will vanish, leaving only the dry desert above. We cannot say how much remains, nor how long it will last. What we can say is that it is finite, and that it connects us to ages when the Sahara was alive with rivers. The careful conclusion here is that water beneath the Sahara is not just a resource, but a record. It is both a survival tool for today and an archive of climates long gone. Its presence tells us that where there is water, there was once life, and where life gathers, memory accumulates. The aquifers are not visible cities, not monuments of stone, but they are nonetheless enduring witnesses of a greener Sahara. Their silence beneath the sands is another way the desert keeps its story, waiting for us to listen with patience. What if the most enduring witnesses of vanished landscapes are not ruins or artifacts, but stones themselves, carrying in their quiet forms the memory of what once was? To look at a rock may feel like looking at something mute, but with patience, its patterns speak. Layers, fractures, grains of mineral, all are like letters in a script of time. In the Sahara, stones are not only remnants of mountains and ancient seabeds, they are also silent pages of an archive written across millions of years. Now we pause and consider how this archive forms. When sand compacts over long spans, it hardens into sandstone. When pressure rises, minerals fuse and create quartzite, a stone so resistant that it endures even as softer layers vanish. Each type of rock tells us something about the conditions under which it formed. Shale often signals calm waters that once covered the land. Limestone holds the shells of long-dead creatures, evidence of shallow seas. These stones are not merely building material. They are environmental diaries. To read them is to read the past with a slower eye. But our knowledge is never complete. Erosion erases, tectonic shifts bury, and time itself fractures what might have been continuous. A sequence of layers may be broken by faults, leaving gaps in the record. Dating methods give ranges, not exact moments. And so, when we look at Sahara's rocks, we glimpse broad strokes, not detailed portraits. Still, broad strokes can tell us much. Now we turn to the language of traces in stone. Patterns of erosion reveal where water once carved valleys. Iron deposits stain rock red, a marker of oxygen-rich atmospheres. Ripple marks frozen in sandstone resemble the small ridges waves leave on a beach, suggesting that long ago the wind or water shaped the surface. Even crystals inside rocks, studied under microscopes, reveal how hot or cold the environment once was. Each marker is indirect, but together they weave a story. Let us imagine gently. Suppose an ancient community lived near a rocky ridge shaped by such layers. They may have used flat stones to build hearths, or harder quartzite for tools. As centuries passed, their presence faded, but the rocks remained, carrying both natural and human marks. Step further, thousands of years onward, and wind begins to polish the exposed surfaces, erasing carvings, but leaving the deeper patterns of mineral structure intact. Step further still, and we find ourselves today, where scientists and travelers walk the same ridges, noticing grooves that hint at rivers, ripples that hint at seas, and wondering quietly if human hands once added their own traces here. In this way, stone becomes both a natural witness and a possible companion to human memory. We should not expect stone to answer directly. Its messages are too broad, too slow, but we may allow it to remind us of time scales larger than our own, where civilizations are brief and geology is enduring. To listen to the Sahara through its rocks is to accept uncertainty. What appears to us as silent hills may hold within their folds not just geological processes, but also landscapes where people once walked, where water once flowed, where life once clustered. The careful conclusion here is simple. Stones, in their silence, are not empty. They are keepers of time, preserving forms and patterns long after memory fades. To walk among them is to touch fragments of Earth's diary, written not in words, but in textures, colors, and layers. They may never confirm Atlantis or any single tale, but they remind us that the desert has a language, one that can be read slowly, softly, with patience. What if the traces of human presence in the Sahara are not grand ruins or towering monuments, but small, delicate signs left by hands long gone? When we look across the desert today, it may seem empty, but scattered within its sands are stone tools, fragments of pottery, faint hearths, quiet reminders that people once lived here. These are not cities preserved in stone, but whispers, fragile and light, that speak of adaptation and survival. To understand them, we need not imagine palaces, but rather families, hunters and herders, who shape their lives around the rhythms of water and climate. Let us pause for a moment on the tools themselves. A flake of flint, sharp on one edge, may look unremarkable at first glance, but it carries meaning. Flint is a hard stone, one that breaks with a predictable fracture. Early people learned to shape it into scrapers, blades, and arrow points. Each piece is a mark of choice and intention. Found across the Sahara, these tools tell us that humans were present through different ages, adjusting as the land shifted from green to dry and back again. They may not tell us stories of cities, but they do show persistence, a quiet resilience that carried communities through vast changes. Now we may think about what we do not know. Tools by themselves do not give us names, languages, or the full scale of societies. A scatter of flakes may represent a single family's camp or part of a wider network of settlements. Without buildings or written records, much is left to interpretation. Archaeologists must piece together patterns from distribution, from wear on stone edges, from the layers in which tools are found. It is like trying to reconstruct a book when only scattered letters remain. This is why we must speak with care, knowing that each discovery is partial. Still, there is a language of traces here, layers of sediment help to date artifacts, showing whether they belong to a wetter age when rivers ran or to drier times when survival was harder. Charcoal from ancient fires preserves chemical fingerprints, allowing scientists to measure its age. Rock art, painted or carved into cliffs, shows animals now absent: giraffes, elephants, and cattle, indirect signs of both environment and human life. These clues, taken together, create a faint outline of how people lived, moved, and adapted in the Sahara over thousands of years. Now let us imagine gently. Suppose a group of people lived near a lake during one of the Sahara's green periods. They hunted fish and grazed cattle, leaving behind small hearths of stone. As climate shifted, the lake shrank. The group moved slowly southward, but some tools were left behind, buried under sand. Step forward a few thousand years, and wind uncovers a piece of flint. A modern researcher finds it, studies its edges, and understands that it was once held in a hand, used to cut or scrape. Step further still, and we may see these scattered signs as part of a larger rhythm, where the desert is not empty, but filled with faint human echoes, preserved quietly in its silence. From this, we may conclude with care that the Sahara, though harsh today, was once home to countless lives. The absence of great ruins does not mean absence of story. It means that the story is written in smaller fragments, in tools and marks, in layers and sediments. These fragments remind us that even in vast deserts, people have always found ways to endure. The desert keeps their memory not in monumental stones, but in subtle traces, waiting to be noticed by patient eyes. What if civilizations, no matter how strong or radiant they once seemed, are always more fragile than the landscapes they inhabit? The Sahara itself, vast and enduring, has watched countless human stories rise and fade across its shifting face. When we think of vanished cultures, we often imagine sudden endings, but in truth, most declines are slow, stretched across centuries, carried by changes in water, soil, and climate. The desert reminds us of this fragility, not with ruins towering above the sands, but with absences, empty valleys where life once clustered, dry basins where lakes once shimmered. To understand this, we may pause on the rhythm of civilizations. Like gardens, they require steady conditions to flourish: reliable water, fertile land, a climate that supports growth. When one of these threads frays, societies adjust. But when several weaken together, the strain deepens, and decline becomes difficult to resist. The Sahara, with its dramatic shifts between wet and dry phases, was both a giver and a taker of stability. During its green periods, human life expanded across wide plains. When the rains withdrew, the same regions became barren, pressing communities to move or transform. Yet our knowledge of these transitions is never perfect. Archaeological evidence is fragmentary. A scatter of tools can suggest continuity or sudden departure, but it cannot tell us whether a community dwindled slowly or migrated in waves. Oral traditions, passed down over generations, preserve memory, but memory bends, reshapes, and often blends events. Written records in this region are rare for the deep past, leaving us with partial glimpses. So we tread carefully, piecing together patterns, accepting that what is not found is not necessarily lost, but perhaps hidden still. The language of traces is subtle here. Layers of lake sediments record not only water levels, but also pollen, showing which plants thrived and which vanished as climates shifted. Bones of cattle found far into the desert suggests pastoral life where today no grazing is possible. Abandoned hearths, sometimes buried under dunes, carry the last charcoal of fires long extinguished. Even isotopes in ancient shells hold information about rainfall, providing small but steady data points. Each trace alone is modest, but together they form a quiet picture of societies adapting, enduring, and sometimes fading. Let us now imagine, carefully. Suppose a community built its life along a river that once crossed the Sahara. For centuries, the river fed crops, gave water to herds, and allowed families to settle in permanence. As the climate shifted, rains dwindled, and the river grew smaller. At first, people dug deeper wells, stretched their herds farther, stored food in clay jars. Over generations, the strain deepened. Some families left in search of greener land. Others remained, holding on until the riverbed dried. In time, the settlement became a shadow, its homes abandoned, its name forgotten. Step forward thousands of years, and perhaps only broken tools and buried hearths remain. The story is not of collapse in a single night, but of gradual erosion, a human parallel to the erosion of stone by wind. Step further still, and we might imagine such a place inspiring legends. A visitor, centuries later, finds ruins half buried, hears local tales of a people who once thrived and then vanished. The story grows, and through the weaving of generations, it transforms into the memory of a lost civilization. Whether or not Atlantis was among them, the Sahara teaches us the pattern. Greatness can vanish, leaving faint traces for future eyes to wonder over. The careful conclusion here is not that all is lost, but that human achievement is bound to climate and land, more delicately than we often admit. Civilizations may appear powerful, but they are threads woven into larger fabrics of earth and sky. When those fabrics shift, even the strongest threads may fray. The desert, in its silence, reminds us of this balance, holding within its sands the whispers of cultures that once were, and perhaps of those still waiting to be found. What if maps, fragile as paper and memory, are themselves traces of worlds that once existed differently, and what if they carry faint echoes of landscapes now hidden beneath the desert? Long before satellites and aerial surveys, people charted the earth with words, drawings, and guesses. Some of these old maps, drawn by Arab geographers, Greek thinkers, or medieval scribes, show not only coastlines and mountains, but also notes of wonder, lost cities, great rivers, deserts that swallowed whole caravans. They are not precise instruments by modern standards, but they are windows into how earlier minds saw and remembered the land. We should pause here and remind ourselves that maps are not always records of fact, but often blends of knowledge, rumor, and imagination. A desert traveler might describe an oasis with exaggeration, a scribe might copy it faithfully, and centuries later the mark remains, whether the place endured or not. Oral traditions, too, often guided such drawings. Stories of golden towns swallowed by sands, of cities blessed with water and then lost, would find their way into the margins of maps. These marks do not prove the existence of Atlantis or any single lost civilization, but they do tell us that human beings were aware of the desert's shifting character and of its power to both reveal and erase. The limitations of such records are clear. Parchment can tear, ink can fade, and translation can alter meaning. A symbol on one map might represent a mountain, but in another copy become a city. Distances were often guessed, so rivers might run in directions they never did. For this reason, historians approach old maps with caution, seeing them as cultural documents rather than reliable coordinates. Still, their language of traces is meaningful. Place names recur across centuries, sometimes moving slightly like shadows shifting with the sun. Mentions of great lakes in the central Sahara may align with dried basins found today through satellite imaging. Reports of vanished cities echo in the ruins uncovered at caravan routes. The overlap between word and land, though imperfect, provides gentle hints. Now let us imagine softly. Suppose a medieval map records a great inland lake, its shores dotted with settlements. At the time, it may have been based on memory of Lake Mega-Chad, which once stretched vast across the region. Step forward through centuries. The lake shrinks, the settlements disperse, and later maps show only desert where water once spread. But the older maps remain, copied and recopied, so that in a future age, someone looking back may wonder if these marks pointed to Atlantis or to another memory now erased. Step further still, and we see how oral stories of lost towns blend into cartography, how myth and geography intertwine until they can no longer be separated. The careful conclusion we may draw is that maps are not evidence of Atlantis, but to look at them is to listen to distant voices trying to fix in ink what sand would not hold. What if the desert, though silent on the ground, reveals more of its memory when we look at it from above, with instruments that circle the earth far beyond the clouds? Satellites, moving steadily in their orbits, give us a view no traveler on foot or camel could ever have. From such heights, dunes arrange themselves like waves in an ocean, dry riverbeds show as pale scars across the land, and ancient structures appear as faint lines almost invisible to the naked eye. The Sahara, vast and seemingly empty, becomes a patterned surface when seen in this way, its hidden features outlined by light, shadow, and subtle shifts of color. To understand how this works, we may pause briefly on the methods. Some satellites use simple photography, capturing the desert as we would see it, but with consistency across seasons. Others use radar, sending signals that penetrate shallow layers of sand, bouncing back to show outlines of buried channels or walls. Still others measure variations in heat or gravity, which can hint at underground water or buried foundations. Together, these tools are like different ways of listening, sometimes to surface sounds, sometimes to deeper echoes. Yet the knowledge we gain is partial. Sand shifts constantly, and not every feature below can be detected. Distinguishing natural formations from human-made structures is not always possible at a distance. What may look like a road may be an old dry stream. What seems a wall may be a ridge of stone. Verification requires ground study, which in so vast and harsh a landscape is not always feasible. So satellites give us possibilities, not certainties, maps of where to look closer, but not definitive answers. Still, the language of traces here is powerful. Images show networks of ancient rivers, long dried but etched so clearly into the desert that they resemble veins on skin. They show outlines of lakes that once spread across hundreds of kilometers, now only remembered in sediments. In some regions, faint geometric patterns have been recorded, which may suggest old settlements or fields, though their origins remain uncertain. These signals do not tell us of Atlantis directly, but they confirm that the Sahara was once alive with water, and where there is water, human presence often follows. Let us imagine softly. Suppose a satellite detects a circular formation buried beneath shallow dunes. At first, it appears natural, perhaps the remnant of a crater or uplift. Step further, and ground study finds shards of pottery nearby, remnants of hearths, traces of settlement. Step further still, and the formation may be understood not as a single great city, but as a cluster of communities arranged by necessity around water. To the people who lived there, it was simply home. To us, from afar, it may seem like the shadow of a legend. Another thought experiment. What if, centuries from now, satellites with even finer resolution reveal under the Sahara not one lost city, but many, each small scattered across the expanse? Together, they might form a network, a web of human presence during green ages. The myth of one grand Atlantis could in this way reflect not a single location, but a memory of many, woven into one story. The careful conclusion is that satellites do not solve the mystery, but they expand our vision. They show us where rivers once ran, where lakes once spread, where patterns suggest human hands. They remind us that the desert is not empty, but full of hidden features too vast for us to notice from the ground. Their quiet orbits are another way of listening to Earth, offering us glimpses of what may still rest beneath the sands. What if what we cannot yet see beneath the sands is not gone, but simply waiting, shielded by distance, time, and the limits of our tools? In science, we often meet the boundary between what is known and what remains hidden. This boundary is not a wall, but more like a horizon, always present, always shifting as our perspective changes. When we study the Sahara, we encounter such horizons constantly. We glimpse rivers in satellite images, but we cannot always measure their age precisely. We find stone tools, but we cannot always link them to particular communities or stories. The absence of certain kinds of evidence does not mean absence of the events themselves. It only means we have not yet uncovered the right layer or learned to read the right signal. Let us pause for a moment on how evidence is limited. Archaeological work in deserts is difficult. Sand shifts, burying what was once visible, uncovering something else, then covering it again. Excavations are costly, and the vastness of the Sahara makes complete exploration impossible. What we find are fragments, and these fragments are not always representative of the whole. Just as a single page cannot summarize an entire book, a shard of pottery or a scatter of bones cannot tell us all of what once was. So, we work with probabilities, not certainties. Now we may note how science navigates these uncertainties. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms in once living material, is powerful, but limited to about 50,000 years. Beyond that, other methods must be used, relying on isotopes in sediments or minerals. These too have margins of error. Climate records drawn from ocean cores or ice layers show when dust from the Sahara was most intense, but they cannot tell us precisely which human communities lived during those shifts. We move step by step, like someone tracing a pattern through fog, building an outline but never holding the full picture. Yet, within these limitations, the language of traces remains. We see pollen trapped in layers of mud that speaks of greener ages. We see isotopes in shells that tell of rainfall. We see dust in Greenland's ice that whispers of desert winds blowing thousands of kilometers away. These indirect signs, though modest, are resilient. They outlast human memory, outlast even ruins, and provide anchors in deep time. Now let us imagine carefully. Suppose a city did exist beneath the Sahara, built during a wet age. Over centuries it was buried, its stones collapsing, its fields fading. Today, satellites might detect faint patterns, but not enough to confirm. Step further, and archaeologists uncover shards of pottery, perhaps a wall line. Without texts or inscriptions, it remains uncertain whether it was a village, a city, or something in between. Step further still, and even after many studies, the conclusion may remain open. A settlement, yes, but its scale and meaning left undefined. The uncertainty does not erase its existence. It only sets the boundary of our knowledge. The careful conclusion is that what we do not know is often as important as what we do. Science thrives not on immediate answers, but on continuing questions. The Sahara reminds us of this balance. Beneath its sands may lie settlements we have yet to uncover, or perhaps only natural formations shaped by time. We cannot yet say. What we can say with humility is that the absence of clear evidence is not a verdict. It is simply an invitation to wait, to look with new tools, and to listen more carefully to the quiet signals the desert allows us. What if Atlantis, if it ever existed, did not rise as a city of marble towers, but left only faint outlines, barely distinguishable from the natural forms of the desert? To imagine this possibility is not to claim it as truth, but to open a quiet space where memory, geology, and human presence might overlap. When Plato described concentric canals and rings of land, some saw echoes of the eye of the Sahara. Others suggest that such images could be metaphors, reshaped by time and translation. Yet, if we ask gently what such a city might look like beneath sand, we do not need to think of grandeur. We may think, instead of traces, lines, fragments, and patterns half buried and half erased. Now let us pause to understand how imagination works with evidence. Archaeologists often build hypotheses from indirect signs. A faint circular formation seen from above, a cluster of pottery shards, a change in soil composition, all can suggest human activity. But each clue on its own is not decisive. Sand and wind can sculpt shapes that mimic walls or roads. Natural salt deposits can form rings that resemble artificial canals. The boundary between natural and human-made is thin, especially when centuries have passed. This is why certainty is rare and humility essential. Still, there is a language of traces to follow. Sediments carry signals of human life in the form of charcoal from ancient fires. Layers of soil enriched by organic matter may point to farming. Isotopes in animal bones can reveal what they ate, hinting at whether herds were domesticated. Even the alignment of stones, if too regular, may suggest a deliberate hand, rather than chance. Each of these signs is modest, but when taken together, they form outlines of human presence. Now let us step softly into a thought experiment. Suppose a satellite detects a circular pattern beneath shallow dunes. At first, it seems geological. A closer look reveals darker soil and bands, possibly enriched by organic remains. Excavation then uncovers fragments of pottery. Step by step, the picture builds. Not a shining metropolis, but perhaps a network of dwellings arranged around water. Step further, and we may imagine how, during a green age, canals or streams once linked these homes. As the desert advanced, water withdrew, houses crumbled, and sand settled in their place. Thousands of years later, what remains is only a faint ring, a suggestion easily mistaken for natural stone. In another step of thought, we may imagine how such a faint memory could transform into legend. Travelers passing through centuries later might hear of an old settlement, describe it as circular, and in retelling, the story grows. By the time it reaches Plato's dialogues, it may already be a blend of truth and imagination. If so, Atlantis might not be a myth born from nothing, but a magnified echo of something small, ordinary, and forgotten. The careful conclusion here is that imagining Atlantis in sand is less about confirming a lost empire and more about exploring how memory and landscape interact. The desert teaches us that even the greatest structures, if they ever existed, can vanish until only shadows remain. We cannot say with certainty that Atlantis lay beneath these dunes, but we can say that the forms and traces of the Sahara invite the question. They remind us that history is often a mixture of what was and what was later told, layered together like sand and stone, waiting quietly for those who come after to notice. What if time itself, with its slow and patient hand, is the greatest eraser of all, softening every trace until it becomes almost invisible? The Sahara offers us a clear lesson in this. What once stood as lakes, rivers, and human settlements has been gradually subdued by wind, sand, and heat. Unlike sudden destruction, which leaves dramatic ruins, the desert works with gentleness, but also with persistence. Grain by grain, dune by dune, it covers, polishes, and transforms. What seems eternal to us is only a passing moment for the desert. To understand this, we may pause on the processes at work. Wind erosion is constant, carrying sand like a stream carries water, scraping and reshaping stone. Over thousands of years, inscriptions on rock are smoothed away. Carvings fade until they look like natural grooves. Structures of clay and wood, once useful to families, are the most vulnerable. They dry, crumble, and blend back into dust, almost impossible to distinguish from the desert that swallows them. Even stone walls, if left exposed, fall grain by grain, toppled by heat in the day and cold at night. Now we acknowledge what we cannot fully know. The desert may have erased countless traces, leaving us only with fragments that survived by chance. A settlement buried quickly by sand may remain hidden, while one left in the open may dissolve into nothing. This makes our search uneven. What is missing may not be because it never existed, but because time has worked more completely in some places than in others. This is why absence cannot be read as proof of emptiness. Still, the desert leaves behind indirect markers, the quiet language of traces. Charcoal fragments from old fires may remain deep in the soil. Layers of sediment sealed beneath dunes preserve pollen grains invisible to the eye, yet still telling us of grasses and trees that grew when rain was more common. Bones of fish, found in regions now far from water, remind us of vanished lakes. Even isotopes, tiny chemical signatures inside minerals, carry the story of how wet or dry the land once was. Each of these markers resists erasure longer than walls or carvings. They are the desert's long memory, faint but still legible. Now let us imagine carefully. Suppose a stone circle was built in a green Sahara, used for gatherings or rituals. At first, it stood firm, surrounded by grass. Step forward 1,000 years, and the climate grows drier. Winds pick up. Grains of sand scrape against the stones, polishing their edges. Another 1,000 years, and dunes rise, burying half the circle. To those who pass, it looks like scattered rocks. Step forward further, and shifting sands finally cover it fully. Millennia pass. The stones remain, but invisible, resting beneath layers that erase the memory from human sight. Only with patient excavation or the gaze of satellites might they be seen again. Another gentle thought. Perhaps Some settlements were never buried, but instead dismantled by time. Walls fell, clay dissolved, wood turned to dust. What remains is not ruin, but absence. Yet even absence leaves subtle fingerprints. In soil richer in nutrients where crops once grew, in alignments of stones where foundations once lay. The land remembers in ways we must learn to read differently. The careful conclusion is that time's silence does not mean nothing happened. It means that the desert, with its long patience, often chooses to hide rather than display. What has been erased from our eyes may still rest in its archives, or may have blended back into the cycles of dust and wind. We cannot say with certainty which traces remain, but we can say that erasure is never complete. Somewhere, faint records endure, waiting for us to notice, and so the Sahara, with its vast silence, teaches us humility before time, reminding us that even what seems permanent can be smoothed away, leaving only whispers beneath the sand. What if the Sahara, quiet in its present vastness, hides ruins that could one day emerge as other forgotten places once did, reminding us that disappearance is not always permanent? Across the world, examples exist of sites buried, concealed, or erased by time, only to be uncovered again by chance or by careful search. Pompeii, for instance, was sealed by volcanic ash, frozen in a moment and rediscovered after centuries. Petra, carved into cliffs of rose stone, lay hidden in plain sight until travelers described it anew. Göbekli Tepe, long buried under soil, appeared only when excavation revealed its circles of carved stone. Each of these places teaches us a quiet lesson. What is lost may still wait, though unseen, and rediscovery often changes our understanding of history. If this is true elsewhere, might not the Sahara also hold its own buried chapters? To understand how such rediscoveries happen, we may pause on the mechanisms of concealment. Pompeii was hidden suddenly in a single event of ash fall. Petra was not buried so much as forgotten, its location slipping from memory until revealed. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally covered, perhaps, as ritual. In the Sahara, the covering process is slower, gentler, but no less complete. Sand drifts, accumulates, and conceals layer after layer so that even large structures might eventually vanish. The desert does not destroy in an instant, but it erases over millennia, which is why what lies beneath is so difficult to predict. Yet we must accept the limits of our comparisons. Pompeii was revealed by excavation, Petra by travel, Göbekli Tepe by chance discovery during farming. Each depended on specific circumstances unlikely to repeat exactly. The Sahara's scale makes the task more daunting. Its covering is not meters of soil in one valley, but dunes stretching across thousands of kilometers. Still, the principle remains. What is unseen is not always absent. Traces may remain below, preserved by the very sands that conceal them. The language of traces here is subtle, but present. Fossils uncovered by wind hint at former lakes. Carvings in sheltered rock faces show animals that once roamed freely. Stone tools scattered across basins suggest past life. These may be small signals, but they remind us that rediscovery is possible, even if fragmentary. Just as the first carved stones of Göbekli Tepe shifted understanding of early civilizations, so too might a find in the Sahara alter our view of what once existed. Now, let us imagine gently. Suppose a caravan route, long abandoned, passed near a buried settlement. For centuries, sand concealed its foundations. Step forward into our present age. A satellite image reveals unusual lines beneath dunes. Step further, Archaeologists investigate, uncovering walls, pottery, fragments of tools. Step further still, the discovery changes how we view human life in the Sahara, showing a larger or more complex settlement than previously imagined. Another gentle thought: what if the desert holds not a single monumental site, but many smaller places, villages, gathering spots, ceremonial circles scattered across its expanse? Each alone would not carry the weight of legend, but together they could explain how stories of a great lost civilization arose. Memory does not always preserve detail, it often magnifies. A chain of forgotten towns could, over generations of retelling, become the story of a single great Atlantis. The careful conclusion is that rediscovery is not a guarantee, but a possibility. The examples of Pompeii, Petra, and Göbekli Tepe remind us that history is layered and that time may conceal more than it erases. The Sahara may yet hold such layers, awaiting the right eyes, the right tools, or perhaps simply the right wind to shift its surface. Until then, it remains silent, patient, and vast, carrying within it the possibility that one day something long hidden will quietly emerge. What if the true challenge in seeking traces beneath the Sahara lies not in what is hidden, but in the immense scale of the desert itself? To walk across it, even in imagination, is to understand how vastness itself becomes a barrier. The Sahara stretches over 9 million square kilometers, larger than many countries combined, wider than the United States or the whole of Europe. Within this expanse, dunes rise and fall like waves of an endless sea, and rocky plateaus extend beyond sight. Searching here for a single settlement, or even a cluster of forgotten communities, is like trying to hear a whisper carried across an empty stadium. We should pause for a moment to think about how scale shapes discovery. Archaeology often depends on proximity. A dig is focused on a site, a trench, a layer. But in the Sahara, sites are scattered, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart, sometimes buried deep beneath shifting sands. Each excavation is only a dot on a vast canvas, leaving most of the surface unexamined. Even modern tools, such as satellites, can only reveal patterns. They cannot confirm directly what lies beneath without people to study the ground itself. This is why progress here is slow and careful. Now let us reflect on what we cannot yet know. It is possible that entire landscapes of ancient life remain undiscovered simply because the desert is too large to search fully. Expeditions have been limited by logistics, by resources, by the harshness of the climate. Windstorms cover tracks overnight. Temperatures swing from burning heat to chilling cold. In such conditions, research is not only difficult, but also dangerous. What lies beyond the areas already studied remains a mystery, and it may remain so for generations. Still, within this immensity, the language of traces persists. From the air, dry riverbeds appear as pale lines stretching for hundreds of kilometers, evidence of water that once crossed the desert like arteries. Satellite images reveal outlines of ancient lakes, now vast salt flats. Rock art appears on cliffs scattered across thousands of miles, showing that humans once moved through and marked these spaces. Each of these signals is not a precise location, but a guide, pointing toward the possibility of settlement and life. They remind us that even in overwhelming scale, signs accumulate if we know how to read them. Let us imagine gently. Suppose a small settlement existed on the edge of a once large lake in the Sahara. Over centuries, sand covered it entirely, leaving no surface sign. Step forward into our present time. A satellite, records of faint discoloration, perhaps too subtle to notice at first. Step further, researchers compare it with older images, noting that the pattern persists. An expedition is planned, and after weeks of travel, tools uncover fragments of pottery or stone. Step further still, these fragments are connected with other finds, and a picture begins to emerge, not of a grand city, but of a network of human life spread across the desert in clusters, each connected by rivers now vanished. Another thought experiment. Perhaps the desert holds dozens of such sites, each small, but together, telling a story of adaptation and endurance. From a distance, scattered traces can appear like points of light. The legend of a single great city might then be the magnification of a much larger but quieter reality. The careful conclusion here is that scale itself is part of the mystery. The Sahara is so wide, so deep, that even if traces of forgotten civilizations exist, they may remain hidden simply because our tools and time are small in comparison. We cannot say with certainty what is there or not there, but we can recognize that vastness itself is a kind of archive, preserving secrets in its silence. The desert's immensity teaches us humility. What we seek may be present, but lost within distances too great for us to easily cross. What if the true fate of civilizations in the Sahara was tied less to conquest or disaster, and more to the long rhythm of climate itself? The desert we see today was not always so barren. Across tens of thousands of years, the Sahara shifted between green and dry phases, shaped by changes in Earth's orbit and tilt, which altered how much sunlight reached different regions. These cycles, known in science as orbital variations, acted like a slow metronome, guiding rainfall northward for some millennia, then drawing it back again. When the rains came, rivers filled, lakes expanded, and grasslands stretched far. People gathered, built, and thrived. When the rains left, the land dried, herds dwindled, and communities either moved away or disappeared quietly. Now we pause and note the mechanism. A greener Sahara came roughly every 20,000 years, when the planet's tilt favored stronger monsoons reaching into North Africa. This allowed wetlands to flourish, even in places that are now endless sand. But when the tilt shifted, the monsoons weakened and deserts returned. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual one. Centuries of diminishing rains, lakes shrinking season by season, rivers slowing until they vanished. To those living at the time, it may have felt like the world itself was withdrawing little by little. We cannot reconstruct every detail with certainty. Layers of pollen and sediments tell us what plants grew, but not the precise order of their decline. Animal remains show which species lived here, but not exactly when they vanished. Radiocarbon dating helps, but only within certain ranges. Oral traditions sometimes echo these transitions, but stories bend over time. So we hold knowledge lightly, with humility, acknowledging both what we can read and what remains hidden. Still, the language of traces is rich. Cores drilled from ancient lake beds in Chad and Niger contain layers of mud dark with organic matter, markers of wetter centuries. Dust in ice cores from Greenland tells us when the Sahara was dry enough for winds to lift sand into the skies. Rock art scattered across cliffs depicts giraffes, elephants, even crocodiles, evidence of a landscape filled with water and life. Together, these signs reveal that climate was the great architect of change, writing its story in cycles. Now let us imagine gently. Suppose a settlement thrived along the shore of a wide lake 8,000 years ago. Families fished, herded cattle, and cultivated small crops. Step forward 500 years, and the rains falter. The lake recedes, leaving muddy flats. Some families migrate toward the Nile or southward into wetter zones. Others remain, hoping for the return of water. Step forward again, and the lake is gone. Sand advances, grasslands vanish, and only scattered tools and hearths remain. To those who stayed, the shift was slow but final, a quiet ending shaped by the sky. Another gentle thought: what if stories of Atlantis were less about one cataclysmic event and more about memory of these slow climatic endings? A great culture, forced to leave its homeland by drought, might live on in stories told generations later. In time, the steady rhythm of climate could be remembered as a sudden fall, reshaped into myth. The careful conclusion here is that climate is both a giver and a taker of civilizations. It allows growth when rains arrive, and it erases when they withdraw. The Sahara reminds us that human history is always entangled with natural cycles, far larger than any city or kingdom. Whether Atlantis was part of this rhythm, we cannot know. But we can say with calm certainty that climate has written and will continue to write the deepest chapters of life in the desert. What if the story of Atlantis, rather than belonging to one place, is instead a thread woven into many cultures, reshaped with each telling, and perhaps connected faintly to the shifting landscapes of the Sahara? Legends travel, much like caravans crossing deserts, carrying goods from one horizon to another. Along the way, the details change, the colors shift, but something of the essence remains. When we think of Atlantis, we often return to Plato's words, but it is worth pausing to see how myths of lost lands appear across traditions. Flood stories, for example, are nearly universal. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to Africa, we hear of waters that once rose and changed the world. These stories may reflect shared memory of ancient climate shifts, or they may arise independently as human responses to the power of water. The Sahara, with its vanished lakes and dried riverbeds, could easily have seeded such tales, told again and again until they became legends. Now we consider the mechanism of transmission. Myths travel not only through writing, but through oral storytelling passed across generations. In oral traditions, stories adapt to the needs of the audience. A memory of migration caused by drought may become a tale of a great city swallowed by the sands. A memory of green pastures may become the dream of a golden age. By the time Plato recorded his account, the story had likely passed through many hands, each reshaping it slightly, like a pot reformed from old clay. We must accept here the limits of certainty. We cannot trace each stage of the story. We cannot know exactly which parts were based on history and which on metaphor. What survives are fragments, hints that align with environmental records, but never enough to confirm direct connection. Still, the language of traces helps us. Ancient Egyptian records describe long cycles of flood and drought. West African oral histories speak of kingdoms that prospered and then faded into the desert. Carvings in Saharan rock art suggest human life, where now there is only emptiness. Each of these signals may connect indirectly with the kind of story Plato told: memory of greatness followed by decline. Let us imagine gently. Suppose a culture thrived on the shores of a vast lake in the Sahara during one of its green phases. Step forward a few centuries, and the lake shrinks, forcing people to move. Step further, and the settlement is abandoned, left to the sands. Step further still, and travelers hear stories of the vanished community. The tale passes from one region to another, told at firesides and in markets until it reaches Egypt, then Greece, reshaped along the way. To those who hear it last, it is no longer a small lakeside town, but a grand city of concentric rings, a symbol of human pride undone. Another thought experiment. What if there were many such vanishings across different times and places in North Africa, a network of forgotten settlements, scattered and erased by climate change, might have created an enduring theme in human memory, the theme of a land once full, now lost. Over generations, these many endings could merge into one legend. The careful conclusion is that Atlantis may not be a single place at all, but rather a reflection of how human beings remember. Myths condense events, magnify them, and carry them across centuries. The Sahara, with its long record of abundance followed by silence, offers fertile ground for such memory. We cannot confirm that Atlantis was here, but we can see how stories of lost worlds might easily have sprung from this shifting land, traveling outward to become one of the most enduring legends of all. What if the traces we seek are not to be found only in sand or stone, but also in the quiet codes of biology, in the genes of plants, animals, and people who once lived at the desert's edge? The Sahara, though dry today, was once a corridor of life, where rivers linked distant lands and herds moved freely. When climate shifted, many of these living beings adapted, migrated, or vanished. Yet their legacy may still be written in DNA, the molecule that carries memory of ancestry. Unlike ruins that crumble or pottery that shatters, DNA can preserve hidden histories within cells, allowing us to glimpse movements and connections far older than written records. To understand this, let us pause briefly on how such memory works. DNA is like a long sentence made of repeating letters, where small changes accumulate over generations. When groups of people move, intermarry, or separate, their DNA records these shifts in its patterns. The same is true for plants and animals. A desert grass that carries genes linked to wetter climates may tell us that its ancestors grew in greener ages. A community of people whose genes show ties to distant coasts may reveal ancient migrations across landscapes now covered in sand. Yet, we must accept the limits. DNA does not give us names, dates, or precise maps. It can suggest directions of movement, degrees of relatedness, but it cannot tell us exactly what events cause those changes. Samples are often scarce, since desert conditions are harsh for preservation. What we know comes from bones found in sheltered caves or from living populations whose ancestry stretches back into deep time. This is why conclusions must be cautious, offered as probabilities, not as fixed certainties. Still, the language of traces here is rich. Studies of human DNA show that groups now living far apart once shared ancestors during the Sahara's greener periods. The spread of certain crops, such as millet and sorghum, carries genetic fingerprints linking them to ancient cultivation in wetter zones of North Africa. Even cattle, whose bones appear in ancient Saharan sites, bear genetic markers that show domestication and movement across the desert thousands of years ago. These are not direct proofs of civilizations, but they are signals of connection, threads that tie today's life to yesterday's landscapes. Let us imagine gently. Suppose a group of people lived beside a large Saharan lake 6,000 years ago. Their herds grazed, their children grew, their communities flourished. Step forward 1,000 years. The lake dries and the group divides, some moving north, others south. Step further, and their settlements vanish beneath dunes. But their genes remain, carried quietly through generations. Thousands of years later, scientists reading DNA patterns discover that people living on distant coasts share ancestry that points back to the Central Sahara. The settlement itself is gone, but its memory endures in biology. Another thought experiment, perhaps the myth of Atlantis, rather than pointing to a single city, reflects the memory of such dispersals, communities fractured by climate, leaving behind not monuments, but descendants. Over time, those memories might have been reshaped into the story of a vanished world. The careful conclusion is that life itself is an archive. While stones may crumble and sands may bury, DNA carries quiet records of migration, adaptation, and survival. We cannot say that these records point to Atlantis, but they show us that the Sahara was once a place of movement and connection, not silence. In the living beings of today, we still find the whispers of those who walked its green fields long ago. What if the real lesson of Atlantis, whether it lies beneath the Sahara or only within our imagination, is not about discovering a single city, but about learning how to listen to the quiet archives of the earth? The desert, in its vastness, has shown us how memory is stored in many forms: rock layers, fossil pollen, dried riverbeds, scattered tools, fading stories, even in the DNA of living beings. Each of these is not a declaration, but a whisper. Taken together, they remind us that the world holds far more than what is visible at first glance. We move gently now to a broader horizon, considering the scales of time involved. Civilizations rise and fall within centuries. Landscapes change within millennia. Climate cycles unfold over tens of thousands of years. Against these spans, a single human life is brief, more like a grain of sand carried by the wind than a dune itself. Yet, through memory, curiosity, and science, we are able to extend our vision, piecing together fragments to glimpse what came before us. Now let us pause on what remains uncertain. We do not know if Atlantis was ever a physical place. We do not know if stories of a vanished land were rooted in a single event or in the gradual fading of many communities. We cannot yet say whether beneath the Sahara rests the echo of a great city or only smaller settlements shaped by water's rise and retreat. Absence of direct proof does not erase the possibility. At the same time, presence of stories does not guarantee their literal truth. Between these two poles lies the space we walk, a space of wonder, humility, and patience. The language of traces helps us keep balance here. Ancient sediments tell us of greener Saharas. Rock art tells us of animals once roaming free. Old maps carry hints of lakes now dry. Genetic records whisper of migrations across lands that seem impassable today. Each of these is a marker, not of Atlantis itself, but of the broader truth that the Sahara has held life, has lost it, and may one day hold it again. Now we may imagine softly, as if tracing a dream. Suppose Atlantis was once real, its people thriving on fertile plains, building homes, creating stories. Step forward, climate changes, waters withdraw, sand advances, the city declines, and memory is carried outward by those who leave. Step further, the story passes into Egypt, then Greece, reshaped until it becomes Plato's tale. Step further still, centuries pass, and we sit here, wondering if it lies beneath the desert we now call empty. Another gentle thought. Suppose Atlantis was never real in stone, but always real in mind, a metaphor for human hubris or for the fragility of greatness before nature's cycles. In this case, the Sahara itself becomes the stage for reflection, its silence teaching us what the story sought to express. The careful conclusion is that Atlantis, whether a city, a memory, or an idea, continues to matter not because we find it, but because we seek it. The Sahara reminds us that searching is itself a way of listening to the earth, to history, to ourselves. Perhaps we will never confirm what lies beneath the sands. Perhaps one day, shifting dunes or advancing tools will reveal more. Until then, we hold the question gently, as one more part of the desert's long silence. If this rhythm speaks to us, if the slow weaving of traces feels like a path worth following, then we already know how to continue, quietly, patiently, and with openness to whatever the sands may still hold.